I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you. Welcome back to It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club podcast. On today's episode, we will have two interviews. We will have an interview with Anita Zannin, who is a blood stain pattern analysis expert. But first, we will have an interview with Rich Cohen.
Rich Cohen is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Tough Jews, Monsters, Sweet and Low, You'll Know I'm Dead with Jerry Weintraub, The Sun and the Moon and the Rolling Stones, and the Chicago Cubs, Story of a Curse. He is a co-creator of the HBO series Vinyl and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and Rolling Stone. He has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Harper's Magazine, among other publications. Cohen has won the Great Lakes Book Award, the Chicago Public Library's 21st Century Award, and the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for Outstanding Coverage of Music. His stories have been included in the Best American Essays and the Best American Travel Writing. Despite frequent predictions, he still lives in Connecticut.
We will be discussing his latest book, The Last Pirate of New York, A Ghost Ship, a Killer, and the Birth of a Gangster Nation. Albert Hicks was a feared, shadowy figure of the New York underworld in the mid-1800s. Handsome and charismatic, he was known to frequent the dive bars and gin joints of the Five Points, the most dangerous neighborhood in the maritime Manhattan. For years, he operated out of the public eye, rambling from crime to crime, working on the water in ships, sleeping in the nickel-a-night flops, drinking in bar rooms where rat baiting and bear baiting were great entertainment. Long fascinated by gangster legends, Rich Cohen tells the story of the notorious underworld figure for the first time, from his humble origins to his incarceration as a demon who terrorized the Five Points and became the gangster most feared by other gangsters at a time when pirates anchored off the 14th Street. Welcome, Rich.
We would like to welcome Rich Cohen to our podcast. He is the author of the fascinating book, The Last Pirate of New York. Welcome, Rich.
Thank you for having me.
For our listeners who have never heard of Albert Hicks, can you give a brief synopsis of what led him to his life of crime?
Well, he was one of 11 siblings from a small town in Connecticut. He grew up on a farm. He was sort of a restless, slightly reckless kid. I don't think he had to become the monster that he did become. But he ran away when he was young, and he ran out of money. He was in Providence, Rhode Island, and he went to the train station and he stole some luggage, pulled the stuff out of the luggage, and he traded it for money to get back home. And he kept some of the things he stole. Someone recognized him. They came to his house. He was arrested, and he was put in an adult's prison, sort of a story about the evils of institutions. And he was sort of brutalized in that prison. He escaped. When they caught him, he was beaten, and his sentence was doubled. He was put on a chain gang with adults. He escaped again. He was caught again and put in solitary confinement for a full year. That was when he was about 17 years old. And he later said that he basically went crazy in that prison in solitary confinement and swore that if he ever did get out, he would take his revenge on the entire world. And that's what he did from the time he got out, which was when he was 20, until the time he was finally identified and captured when he was around 40.
After reading about Albert, we're kind of surprised that no one's ever heard of him. Why do you think that is?
Well, a couple reasons. One is he went on this famous crime spree, which sort of riveted the whole country the summer before the Civil War. And I always liken it to, it's like just before the whole nation got hit by a comet. I mean, the Civil War changed everything, and it put everything pre-Civil War into another era in amber. And it was sort of lost in the headlines and lost in the newspapers. But then on the other hand, he did stay famous for a long time because P.T. Barnum, who sort of created our whole modern culture in a way, he made a wax figure of him and put it in his American Museum where it was seen by millions of people, advertised as Albert Hicks, the worst man who ever lived. He was a household name, I think, up until the 1950s or 60s. I read a story in the New Yorker from the 1920s about the last hangman of the Tombs prison. And that guy said in the 20s that the highlight of his career was hanging Albert Hicks, the pirate. And they didn't identify him any more than that, which to me means that they expected everyone to know who he was. And there was a Twilight Zone, if you remember the TV show, in the 1960s about a guy who owns a wax museum, and it's being shut down, and the wax figures come to life and start killing people. Two of those wax figures who come to life are Jack the Ripper and Albert Hicks. So he was considered famous enough that people watching TV in 1960 would know who he is. Sometime later, maybe because a book, which hopefully I've written, had never been written, and because there were no photographs, no one put it together, people forgot who he was. But I think that that's to my great fortune as a storyteller, which is I found this incredibly rich story that was just sitting there. To me, it was like finding a wallet stuffed with foreign money.
Yeah.
Now, why do you consider Albert Hicks to be a link between Bluebeard and John Gotti?
My first book was about Jewish gangsters called Tough Jews. And in researching that book, which was about Murder Incorporated, which was a gang from my father's old neighborhood in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in researching that, I really came to see that the underworld was a culture as much as the upper world was a culture. It had its founding fathers and its heroes, who we call anti-heroes, and its villains, and its morals, and its code of ethics, and its everything else. I discovered that one of the guys that created that culture, and one of the guys who was famous among gangsters, was Albert Hicks. And it wasn't just his crime spree. It was his very famous, very carefully watched trial and his execution, the way he dressed, the way he talked, the way he handled himself. And just to be very simple about it, he created a certain kind of style that was copied by other gangsters and that you see the reflection of in movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas. And Albert Hicks, who created this style that was really in the first slum in New York, which was the 5 Points, which was downtown where the first gangsters come from. He had really lived most of his life, not as a gangster as we know them, but on the water as a pirate, and was in fact tried and convicted of piracy, which is why he hung. So to me, he was like the last pirate who crawls out of the primordial ooze and becomes the first gangster. He's the living human connection between Bluebeard and John Gotti.
You mentioned the other books you've written about gangsters. Are there any other gangsters that have caught your interest enough to write a book about?
Well, just the first one, which was Tough Jews, called that because the phrase sort of jarred people. Really, I grew up outside of Chicago. My father was from Brooklyn. And when people would ask me what my father's job was, I would say, I thought being from Brooklyn was his full-time job, because that's all he ever seemed to do was be from Brooklyn. When other kids would hear bedtime stories, about the Three Little Pigs or whatever, he would tell me stories about the Brooklyn gangsters of his childhood. And these guys were Jewish just because it was a Jewish neighborhood. These were guys like Abe Kid Twist Rellis, who later testified against members of his own gang and was thrown out of the Half Moon Hotel. And the New York Post, in one of its greatest headlines ever, called him the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. Happy Levine and Tic-Tac Tannenbaum and Gangy Cohen. They're still a famous gang. They took orders from like Louis Lepke, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel. This was a generation younger. And that was really what I focused on as far as gangsters go. And that led me to Albert Hicks, because these guys would sit around and tell stories about Albert Hicks.
Well, do you think Albert Hicks would have ever been caught and we would have ever heard about him if that boat had sunk?
No, I don't. I mean, he'd been doing what he'd been doing for 20 years, which is he would join the crews of ships and wait for the right moment and then mutiny, sometimes alone, sometimes with a partner, kill the officers of the ship because, as he said later, dead men tell no tales, sink the ship and take off. And back then there was no forensic evidence. There was no real police work. It was just the beginning of the New York Detective Department. So if the ship sunk and there were no bodies, you couldn't prove any murder. There were so many weird stories of ships that just disappeared at sea, and maybe they sunk. Who knows what happened? It just became another one of those stories. And almost like in classic movie fashion, Hicks was older. He was 40 years old, which in pirate years, that's like 92 years old. I mean, that's an old pirate, 40 years old, especially in the 1850s and 60s. He had a wife and a newborn child, And this was going to be his last crime to set him up in his retirement. And if he'd been born later and had seen a lot of movies like I had, he would have known the last one that you used to set up your retirement is always the one that goes wrong and you get caught. And that's what happened here.
Another interesting character in the book was Isaiah Renders. He had such a shady past, but still ended up as a federal marshal. How did that come to be?
Well, politics in New York back then, and maybe still now to some extent, but I'm not an expert on it, was very shady, dirty business. We have this way of idealizing the past and saying elections used to be better, the Russians are stealing our elections, or whatever it is. Back then, New York elections were there for the stealing, and Isaiah Renders was the kind of guy that made the system work. And that was the old corrupt New York politics. He was from upstate New York. He was a captain of a little boat on the Hudson River, and ever after that, he insisted on being called Captain Renders. He went out west where you went to make your fortune. He was a card sharp on the Mississippi riverboats and a knife fighter, and he eventually came back to New York, and he owned what they called groggeries, which were little grocery stores in the slums, the 5 Points, that had little illegal saloons in the back, and kids hang out there. These kids were loyal to him. They formed a gang called the Dead Rabbits, because when they fought, they carried a standard, a huge pole with a dead rabbit on it. With that gang, he controlled the 5 Points, which meant he controlled its votes, and he controlled the votes of all the slums of downtown, and he helped to get out the votes for mostly Democratic politicians, and he was said to have secured the election for James Buchanan. As a reward for that, James Buchanan made him New York City's federal marshal. That gave him tremendous power over Hicks trial. So he was sort of himself a connection between the upper world and the lower world. You know, I grew up in Chicago. It's really not that different from stories I'd hear about Mayor Daley getting the vote out for John F. Kennedy and securing him the election when Kennedy became president. Things change, but the basic things, a lot of them stay the same.
Very true.
Once Albert Hicks was apprehended, he confessed to many crimes. Do you think he was just grabbing the limelight and stalling, or was he being truthful?
Well, that's one of the mysteries, which is he gave this unbelievable confession, which ran as a little book and is sort of one of the strangest documents in American history, I think. And the question is, how real is it? He basically never believed he would get caught for the reasons I said, mostly because there was no physical evidence. He had thrown the bodies overboard. They found 4 severed fingers and a thumb on the ship, which was otherwise empty and abandoned. So that was the only physical evidence, but that's not bodies. So he believed he'd get off and at worst get sentenced to prison for robbery, for robbing the ship, not for killing the people on the ship. The trial lasted a week. It was thousands and thousands of people standing outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan watching this trial. Once the judge basically read the words, on this day, Friday, July 13th, 1860, you'll be taken to Bedloes Island, which is now Liberty Island, where the Statue of Liberty stands, right outside Lower Manhattan, and you'll be hung there by the neck till dead. It hit him that he would not escape this time and that he was going to die. Now, he believed that when he was young and he was in solitary confinement, that he had actually made a deal with the devil and that the devil had protected him and would continue to protect him. And he believed that when he was caught, the devil had abandoned him. There was a priest that went to see him, Father Derniquet, who was from a famous French Catholic family whose specialty was working with people on death row. And Hicks basically decided at the end of his life to make a bargain, to change sides. He did this in a very opportunistic way. He said, basically, the devil abandoned me. Can I abandon the devil? Or in other words, is it too late for me to switch teams and to go into heaven? And the priest said, no, you can do that, but you have to confess and really mean it and confess to everything, not just this crime, but to all your sins, and accept Jesus into your life, and you can earn immortality in the next life. And then he gave that confession, and he confessed to over 100 murders that took place all over the world in those previous 20 years. And he got paid some money, but the money would do him no good. The money went to his wife and his child, and it wasn't even that much money, really. I would say you can leave that up for grabs about whether or not it's true. However, after the confession was published and after he had died, people wrote into the police in New York from all over the world, basically using that confession to solve unsolved murders that Hicks had confessed to, which is, yes, this happened here, we never know who did it. Yes, this happened here, we never know who did it. In a way, it was corroborated. For that reason, I do believe his confession.
You mentioned that Albert had a wife. Did you find out any more information about her after his death?
No, because this is what's interesting, which is this is a true story. I could have written it as fiction. I wanted to write it as nonfiction, so everything in it's got to be completely true, which means there's limits to what I can know. And to me, that's a good thing, not a bad thing as a reader, because the limits are where you as a reader reader can use your imagination to try to figure out what happened. And the truth is that if this happened today, and things like this do happen today, the press would be all over the wife and the child and the extended family, because there was an extended family.